Marcus and Isabel Davison seemed to be the perfect newlywed couple. They had just celebrated their 6-month wedding anniversary, living a life that appeared full of happiness and love. Friends and family saw them as a great match, both young, ambitious, and ready to build a future together. But behind their smiles was a secret that would soon unravel in the most tragic way. Late one night, Marcus stumbled upon a part of Isabel's life that she had kept hidden, a truth that shocked him to his core. Isabel was transgender, something she hadn't revealed to Marcus before their marriage. Marcus, feeling betrayed and confused, reacted in a way no one could have expected. What started as an ordinary evening quickly spiraled into a night of horror. This is the chilling story of how love, trust, and identity collided, leading to a terrible crime that no one saw coming. As we go deeper into the events of that night, we'll see how a single discovery ended in an act of violence that shocked everyone who knew them. The questions left behind still haunt those who were close to Marcus and Isabel. Let's uncover the truth behind this devastating moment and the tragic end of a love story that could have been so different. Marcus Davison and Isabel were the picture-perfect couple. Both were in their late 20s, fresh in their marriage, and full of plans for the future. Marcus had a steady job in construction management, while Isabel worked as a freelance designer, often at home. Their life together seemed smooth and effortless. Friends described them as inseparable, always together at family gatherings, and never without smiles. They had only been married for 6 months, but those 6 months seemed like the start of a happy, long-lasting journey. They had met 2 years earlier at a mutual friend's party. Marcus was immediately drawn to Isabel's energy. She had this natural charm, a sense of ease about her that made everyone around her feel comfortable. Isabel, with her calm and gentle personality, balanced Marcus's more outspoken and strong-willed nature. To everyone on the outside, they were a perfect match. Their courtship was quick. Marcus proposed after a year, unable to imagine his life without her. Their wedding was small, just close family and a few friends. They didn't have a large budget, but it didn't matter. They were happy. They rented a modest apartment in the city, and Isabel took charge of decorating their new space. With their different work schedules, they found a good rhythm. Marcus left early for work, Isabel worked from home, and they had dinner together most nights. But underneath the happiness was a secret. Isabel was transgender, something she had not yet told Marcus. She had planned to tell him early in their relationship, but as their bond grew deeper, the timing never felt right. As they moved closer to marriage, the weight of this hidden truth pressed on her, but fear kept her silent. She loved Marcus deeply, and she didn't know how he would react. Isabel thought she would eventually find the courage, but she kept delaying the conversation, hoping that their love would be strong enough to survive the truth when it came out. Marcus had no idea. He trusted Isabel completely, never questioning anything about their relationship. To him, everything was as it should be. They had built a life together, and that was all that mattered. He wasn't the type to overanalyze, happy to focus on his work and their life together. His love for Isabel was genuine and unshakable, at least until the night everything changed. One evening after dinner, Marcus was cleaning up in the kitchen while Isabel was in their bedroom, working on her laptop. They had spent the evening talking about their future, maybe buying a house in the next couple of years, and even starting a family. It was a conversation they had often, and it made Marcus excited for what lay ahead. Little did he know that all of those dreams were about to shatter. Marcus needed Isabel's phone to check something, and when he walked into their room, she was out of sight, in the bathroom. He grabbed the phone off the bed, but the screen lit up with a message she had received. It was nothing shocking, just a notification, but as Marcus swiped away the notification, his finger opened up her photo gallery by accident. A series of old photos appeared, photos Isabel hadn't shared with Marcus, photos that told a different story of her past. The first few were ordinary, but the further Marcus scrolled, the more confused he became. There were photos from years ago, pictures of Isabel before she had transitioned. In those pictures, Isabel appeared as someone entirely different. Marcus froze. He didn't know what to make of what he was seeing. He kept scrolling, hoping there was some explanation he hadn't thought of, but with every new image, the truth became clearer. His heart began to race. Marcus didn't understand. His thoughts were moving too fast, jumping between disbelief, anger, and confusion. He couldn't breathe properly, standing there with the phone in his hand, feeling as if the ground beneath him was crumbling. He felt like he had been living a lie. The woman he thought he knew, the woman he had married, had hidden something so huge from him, and now it was all coming crashing down in an instant. Isabel stepped out of the bathroom, noticing Marcus standing there, her phone in his hand. She knew immediately what had happened. The look on his face was one of shock, disbelief, and slowly growing anger. There was no way to explain, no words that could take back what he had seen. Isabel's heart sank. She had always feared this moment, but now that it was here, she realized she had no plan, no way to make things right. Marcus's confusion quickly turned into rage. His thoughts were clouded by a feeling of betrayal, hurt that was so deep he couldn't even find the words to express it. The man who had always been calm, level-headed, and protective of his wife now felt blindsided, like he had been deceived in the most personal way. Everything in their relationship, every memory, every conversation, now felt false to him. How could he trust anything anymore? Isabel tried to speak, but Marcus couldn't hear her. His anger was boiling over, consuming him. All he could think about was how he had been lied to, how the life he thought he had was now tainted by this hidden truth. Isabel tried to explain, but nothing she said seemed to calm Marcus. She had kept this secret for too long, and now it had destroyed everything. The tension in the room grew, thick and heavy. Marcus was pacing, his fists clenched, trying to make sense of what he had seen, but it was no use. His mind was spiraling out of control. Isabel, on the other hand, was filled with regret, realizing that her silence had caused this situation, but there was no turning back now. The air between them crackled with emotion, a mix of fear, anger, and sorrow. Neither of them could stop what was about to happen next. In a fit of uncontrollable rage, Marcus lashed out. The hurt he felt, the sense of betrayal, overwhelmed him. He had never been violent before, never raised his hand in anger, but in that moment, everything inside him snapped. He attacked Isabel, fueled by a mix of fury and heartbreak. It was sudden, and before either of them could process what was happening, it was too late. The violence escalated quickly, spiraling out of control in a matter of minutes. By the time Marcus realized what he had done, Isabel was lying motionless on the floor. The room was silent, except for the sound of his heavy breathing. His anger, which had flared so intensely just moments before, had now given way to shock. He stared down at her, horrified by the reality of what had just happened. The woman he had loved, the woman he had married, was now gone. In his moment of blind rage, he had taken everything away. Marcus stumbled backward, his hands shaking, unsure of what to do next. His mind raced, trying to process the gravity of his actions, but the weight of what he had done was crushing him. He had just committed the ultimate crime, and there was no undoing it. As Marcus stood there, frozen in place, the life he had known just hours before was now shattered beyond repair. The love, the future they had talked about, the family they had dreamed of, it was all gone. In its place was only darkness, the irreversible consequences of a night that would forever change his life. In the cold, heavy silence that followed Isabel's murder, Marcus could barely comprehend what had just happened. His hands, still trembling, were stained with blood, his heart pounding so hard it echoed in his ears. He stood over Isabel's lifeless body, paralyzed by the horror of his actions. The room that had once been filled with the warmth of their love now felt cold, suffocating, and unbearably still. Minutes passed like hours. Marcus couldn't think straight. The woman he had shared his life with, his wife, was gone, and he was the one responsible. He tried to replay the moments in his head, looking for a way to undo what had happened, but there was no going back. The weight of his actions crushed him, but panic quickly set in. He realized that this wasn't just a nightmare. He could wake up from this was real, and now he had to face the consequences. Marcus had always been the kind of man who followed the rules, lived a simple life, and worked hard for everything he had. Now, in one terrible moment of rage, he had destroyed all of that. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and all he could feel was a deep, gnawing fear. What had he done? What was he supposed to do now? His mind raced with questions, but none of them had answers. Instinct took over as Marcus grabbed his phone. His first thought was to call someone, anyone but who. He couldn't call the police, not yet. He didn't know how to explain this. His best friend, James, flashed into his mind, but what would he say? How could he possibly make sense of this to anyone? The fear of being caught and thrown into a prison cell began to creep in, clouding his judgment even more. He stared at Isabel's phone on the bed, the very object that had started this downward spiral. The gallery of images still open on the screen reminded him of the truth he had discovered just moments earlier. Everything about his life now felt like a lie, a twisted story he never signed up for. But deep down, Marcus knew that Isabel's secret, no matter how shocking it had been to him, didn't justify what he had done. He had let his anger consume him, and now he had to live with that forever. The panic inside him grew. He paced around the room, unsure of his next move, his thoughts a jumbled mess of fear, guilt, and desperation. He glanced at Isabel's motionless body again and felt a wave of nausea rise in his throat. He had to do something. He had to get out of here. But where would he go? He couldn't stay in their apartment, surrounded by the evidence of his crime, with every object in the room reminding him of their life together. After what felt like an eternity, Marcus finally made a decision. He knew he couldn't cover this up, and running away wouldn't solve anything. His mind returned to James. He needed help, someone to talk him through this, someone who could think more clearly than he could in this moment. Without thinking any further, he grabbed his phone and dialed James's number. James answered after a few rings, his voice casual and relaxed, not knowing the chaos that had just unfolded on the other end of the line. Marcus couldn't find the right words at first. His voice cracked, barely able to get out a sentence, but as James's tone shifted, realizing something was very wrong, Marcus began to explain. He told James about the discovery he had made, how he had reacted in a moment of uncontrollable rage, and what had happened next. There was silence on the other end. James, trying to process what Marcus had just told him, couldn't believe what he was hearing. His best friend, someone he had known for years, had just confessed to killing his wife. It didn't make sense. James felt a mix of shock, disbelief, and an overwhelming sense of dread. He tried to stay calm, knowing that Marcus was clearly in a state of panic and confusion. James didn't know what to say. He wanted to help, but how could he? What could anyone do in a situation like this? There was no undoing what had been done. After a few minutes of silence, James urged Marcus to turn himself in, to stop running from the truth. It was the only option, the only way forward, even if it meant facing the consequences. There was no other way. Marcus, barely able to hold himself together, hung up the phone. The weight of James's words sank in, but he wasn't ready to face the reality just yet. His fear was still stronger than his guilt. He didn't want to go to prison. He didn't want his life to end like this. But the more he thought about it, the clearer it became he had no other choice. Hours passed. Marcus sat in the living room, his mind numb. He didn't move. He didn't know how long he had been sitting there staring at the wall. Time had lost all meaning. The apartment, once filled with the everyday sounds of life, was now hauntingly silent. Outside, the sun had set, and darkness covered the city. But inside, Marcus's mind was a storm of thoughts, each one more terrifying than the last. Eventually, Marcus stood up. His body felt heavy, his limbs stiff, but he knew what he had to do. He grabbed his jacket and walked out the door, leaving behind the home he had shared with Isabel, the life they had built together, and the crime that now haunted him. He drove aimlessly through the city for what felt like hours, the streets empty and quiet, mirroring the emptiness he felt inside. Finally, Marcus found himself parked outside the police station. The lights from the building seemed too bright, too harsh for the darkness that had consumed his life. He sat there in the car, staring at the entrance, knowing that once he stepped inside, everything would change. His life, as he had known it, was over. After what felt like another eternity, Marcus gathered the strength to walk inside. His heart raced, his palms sweaty as he approached the front desk. He didn't need to explain much. The officers could see it in his face, the look of a man broken, lost, and ready to confess to a crime that would haunt him forever. Detective Henry Willis was called in to take Marcus's statement. A seasoned investigator, Willis had seen his fair share of confessions, but something about Marcus's story felt different. The calm exterior Marcus had when he walked in was deceiving. Underneath, Willis could sense the chaos, the internal struggle that had led to this point. As Marcus began to explain the events of that night, the detective listened carefully, piecing together the moments that had led to this tragedy. Marcus told the story slowly, his voice low, barely above a whisper at times. He spoke of his discovery, the shock he felt, the betrayal that consumed him, and the rage that ultimately led to Isabel's death. As he recounted the details, Marcus's voice wavered, the guilt and shame rising to the surface. He couldn't justify what he had done. There was no excuse. He had let his emotions control him, and now he would have to pay for that. Detective Willis remained silent throughout, letting Marcus's words fill the room. There was nothing more to say. Marcus had confessed, and the reality of his actions was undeniable. Isabel's life had been taken, and now Marcus's life would never be the same. As the confession ended, the weight of the situation sank in for everyone involved. Marcus was formally arrested, charged with murder, and taken into custody. The story that had begun with so much hope, so much promise, had ended in the darkest way possible. The love Marcus and Isabel had shared was now overshadowed by tragedy, and nothing could ever bring that back. After Marcus's shocking confession, the wheels of the investigation began to turn quickly. Isabel's body was taken in for an autopsy, and forensic experts combed through the apartment for additional evidence. The details of the crime were clear. There had been no struggle, no signs of forced entry, and everything pointed to a crime of passion. Marcus's confession aligned perfectly with the evidence. It was an open and shut case in many ways, but the police needed to ensure every detail was accounted for. Detective Henry Willis, who had taken Marcus's confession, took charge of the case. As he walked through the apartment, now a crime scene, he could see the remnants of what had once been a happy home. Photos of Marcus and Isabel on the walls, a half-empty coffee cup on the kitchen counter, and the faint scent of candles still lingering in the air. The apartment seemed frozen in time, as if the events of that fateful night hadn't completely taken over. But beneath the surface, everything had changed. Forensic teams gathered evidence, though the crime itself was straightforward. The investigators collected the murder weapon, a kitchen knife Marcus had used, and analyzed the blood patterns and fingerprints. The story Marcus told matched what they found. This wasn't a premeditated act. It was spontaneous, fueled by intense emotion, and ended in the worst possible way. Isabel's autopsy confirmed the cause of death, and her injuries were consistent with Marcus's confession. While the police worked to piece everything together, news of Isabel's death spread quickly. What made this case even more complex wasn't just the murder, it was the fact that Marcus had killed his wife after discovering she was transgender. The public outcry was immediate. This wasn't just seen as a domestic murder, it was viewed as a hate crime by many. Advocacy groups and communities rallied, demanding justice for Isabel, seeing this as an attack not only on her but on the broader transgender community. Isabel's death became a symbol of the violence faced by transgender people, and her story quickly gained national attention. Marcus, now sitting in a jail cell, could feel the weight of the world closing in around him. The initial shock of his crime had faded, replaced by the cold reality of what he had done. He had loved Isabel. In the quiet moments of his cell, he found himself thinking about their life together, the good times they had shared. But then the image of that night would flood his mind, and he would be reminded that he had destroyed all of that in one terrible moment. The media picked up on the story quickly, and soon it was all anyone could talk about. News outlets painted Marcus as a monster, a man who couldn't handle his wife's truth and lashed out violently. People took to social media, condemning him, while others debated the complexities of his actions. It was a story that stirred emotions from every corner of society about love, trust, betrayal, identity, and rage. Detective Willis, though a seasoned investigator, had never dealt with a case that struck such a nerve in the public. He knew that Marcus's trial would be about more than just the crime. It would spark debates about acceptance, intolerance, and the struggles faced by the transgender community. Isabel's family, devastated by the loss, released a statement calling for justice, saying they had lost not just a daughter but a brave woman who had fought to live her truth. The investigation also revealed more about Isabel's life. Friends of Isabel came forward to talk about her journey. She had transitioned several years before meeting Marcus, but not everyone in her life had accepted her decision. She had faced challenges, like many in the transgender community, but she had found happiness in her relationship with Marcus, until that secret became too heavy to keep. Isabel's friends described her as kind, gentle, and someone who always put others before herself. They couldn't understand how things had gone so wrong between her and Marcus. Meanwhile, Marcus's side of the story began to come to light as well. His best friend James, the one he had called in desperation after the murder, tried to make sense of what had happened. James described Marcus as a calm, level-headed person, someone who had never shown signs of violence or intolerance. But James also admitted that Marcus had been blindsided by Isabel's secret, and in his fragile state he had reacted in a way that no one could have predicted. The pressure mounted as the case moved toward trial. Marcus's defense attorney, assigned by the state, prepared for what would be an incredibly complex case. The defense wasn't going to argue Marcus's innocence. He had confessed, and the evidence was undeniable. But the defense wanted to highlight Marcus's emotional state, claiming that the discovery of Isabel's secret had led to a sudden, uncontrollable reaction, a crime committed in a moment of rage rather than premeditated hate. The prosecutor, on the other hand, was determined to show that Marcus's actions were rooted in something much darker. The state argued that Marcus had reacted violently not just because of the secret, but because of his deep-seated intolerance. They were prepared to push for the harshest penalty possible, claiming that Marcus had committed a hate crime. As the trial date approached, the community remained divided. Some saw Marcus as a man pushed to his breaking point, a person who had acted out of emotional shock rather than hate. Others viewed him as a symbol of the violence that transgender people face every day. Isabel's death was no longer just a family tragedy, it had become a flashpoint for the broader fight for transgender rights and recognition. The trial was set to be the biggest moment in both Marcus's and Isabel's family's lives. Marcus knew that once he stood before the court, there would be no more hiding from the truth. Everything that had been kept secret, Isabel's identity, Marcus's feelings of betrayal, and the violent act that followed would be laid bare for everyone to see. But as Marcus sat in his cell, he wasn't thinking about the trial. His mind kept returning to that moment, the moment when he had lost control. He couldn't stop replaying it, couldn't shake the feeling that everything could have been different if only he had reacted with love instead of anger. For Detective Willis, the case was a sad reminder of how quickly love could turn to violence. He had seen it before in other cases, but something about this one felt different. The layers of complexity, identity, acceptance, betrayal made it a tragedy that went far beyond the walls of a courtroom. It was a story that touched everyone who heard it, a story that left people wondering how two people, so in love, could end up in such a dark place. As the investigation wrapped up and the trial loomed closer, one thing was clear: no one would leave this case unchanged. Isabel's death had opened a conversation that needed to be had, but the pain of her loss was one that would never fully heal. The day of the trial finally arrived, and the courtroom was packed. Media crews gathered outside, advocacy groups held signs in protest, and both families, Isabel's and Marcus's, sat quietly, waiting for the proceedings to begin. It was a trial that carried the weight of not only a crime but also the questions of identity, acceptance, and justice. The eyes of the public were fixed on the case as they waited to see how the court would handle this tragic situation. Marcus, now looking far older than his 29 years, sat in the defendant's chair, his eyes cast downward. The weeks in jail had taken a toll on him. He had lost weight, his hair was unkempt, and the once confident man now seemed broken. But it wasn't just the physical toll that had changed him. Inside, he was haunted by the events of that night, playing them over and over again in his mind. He knew that whatever the outcome of the trial, he would never escape the guilt of what he had done. The prosecution began by painting Marcus as a man driven by hate and intolerance. They presented his reaction to Isabel's identity as proof that he had been unable to accept the truth about the woman he had married. They focused on the violence of his actions, showing how Marcus had taken his anger and confusion and turned it into a brutal act of murder. The state argued that this was more than a crime of passion, it was a crime motivated by Marcus's inability to accept Isabel's identity as a transgender woman. Witnesses were called to testify, including some of Isabel's closest friends. They spoke of Isabel's struggles, her bravery in living her truth, and the love she had for Marcus. But they also spoke of her fears of how people, especially Marcus, would react to her past. The prosecution used these testimonies to highlight the vulnerability of transgender individuals and how Isabel had faced violence simply for who she was. Marcus's defense attorney, on the other hand, focused on the emotional state of Marcus the night of the murder. They argued that this was a crime of passion, a sudden and uncontrollable reaction to a shocking revelation. Marcus hadn't planned this, he had acted in a moment of confusion, hurt, and betrayal. The defense presented Marcus as a man who had been blindsided by a truth he wasn't prepared to face, and who had, in a moment of rage, made a terrible mistake. James, Marcus's best friend, was called to testify for the defense. He spoke about Marcus's character, how he had never shown any signs of violence or intolerance before. James admitted that while Marcus's reaction was extreme, he believed that his friend had acted out of emotional shock, not hatred. The defense tried to frame Marcus as a man whose emotions had taken over, leading to a tragic, irreversible mistake. As the trial went on, it became clear that this wasn't just about Marcus and Isabel. The case had become a symbol of the broader struggles faced by the transgender community. Outside the courtroom, activists gathered, calling for justice not only for Isabel but for all transgender individuals who faced violence and discrimination. Isabel's death had become part of a larger conversation, one that touched on the deep-seated prejudices that still existed in society. The jury deliberated for days. The weight of the case, the emotions involved, and the complex layers of identity and violence made it difficult to reach a conclusion. But finally, they returned with a verdict. Marcus was found guilty of second-degree murder. The jury determined that while Marcus had acted in a moment of rage, it was still a deliberate and violent act that resulted in Isabel's death. They acknowledged that it wasn't premeditated, but it was still a crime that carried severe consequences. Marcus was sentenced to 25 years in prison with no possibility of parole for the first 15 years. The courtroom was silent as the verdict was read. Isabel's family wept quietly, knowing that while justice had been served, it would never bring their daughter back. Marcus sat motionless, accepting the sentence with a sense of resignation. There were no outbursts, no final words, just the quiet acknowledgement of a life ruined by one terrible moment of violence. As Marcus was led away in handcuffs, the reality of his future sank in. He would spend the next 25 years behind bars, haunted by the memory of the woman he had loved and the crime he had committed. He knew that no matter how much time passed, he would never escape the guilt of that night. Isabel's death would weigh on him for the rest of his life. For the transgender community, Isabel's death became a symbol of the ongoing fight for acceptance and safety. Advocacy groups continued to push for greater awareness of the violence faced by transgender individuals and the importance of protecting their rights. Isabel's name became part of that larger movement, a reminder of the dangers that still existed for those who lived outside of society's narrow definitions. In the months that followed the trial, life moved on, but the impact of Isabel's death lingered. Her family, though devastated, became vocal advocates for transgender rights, working to ensure that Isabel's legacy would not be forgotten. They spoke at rallies, participated in discussions, and worked with organizations to push for change. Isabel's story became one of both tragedy and hope, a painful reminder of how far society still had to go, but also a spark for the continued fight for justice. Marcus, now serving his sentence, found himself lost in the solitude of his prison cell. He spent his days reflecting on what had happened, trying to understand how he had let his anger destroy everything. The love he had felt for Isabel had been real, but the betrayal he had perceived had blinded him, leading him down a path of violence that he would regret for the rest of his life. In the end, Isabel's death was a tragedy born of secrecy, misunderstanding, and rage. It was a story that touched on the most personal and painful aspects of human relationships: the struggle for identity, the fear of rejection, and the consequences of our darkest emotions. For Marcus and Isabel, there would be no happy ending, no redemption. But for those left behind, her story became a catalyst for change, a call to action for a world where everyone could live their truth without fear.